For any of you who have visited or lived in New York City, these shots might start to look familiar. This is Central Park, one of the most beautifully designed public spaces in America. But for anyone who hasn't actually been there, well, these images can only convey so much. To really understand and to experience Central Park, well, you have to physically be there. Well, the same could be said about the music you're hearing right now. That's because this music was not only composed for, but also mapped to Central Park. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the work that I do with my brother, specifically about this idea that we've been developing over the last few years, this idea of music composed for physical space. So my brother Hayes and I, we've been working together since we were kids. That's us there. That's both of us, actually. Now, we're musicians and producers, but in recent years, we've become more and more interested in projects where art and technology intersect, from creating site-specific multi-channel sound installations to engineering interactive concerts. But in recent years, we've become more and more interested in this idea of music as it pertains to a physical space. But before I unpack that idea a little bit more, I want to go back and tell you kind of how we got started with this. So Hayes and I were living in New York City when the artists Christo and Jean-Claude did their temporary installation, The Gates, in Central Park. Hundreds of these brightly colored sculptures decorated the park in Manhattan for a number of weeks. And unlike work that's exhibited in a more neutral environment, like on the walls of a gallery or a museum, this work was really interacting with the space. And in a lot of ways, The Gates was a celebration of Frederick Olmsted's incredible design. So this is an idea that stuck with us for a while, and years later, we moved back to our hometown of Washington, D.C. So we began to ask the question, would it be possible, in the same way that The Gates responds to the physical layout of the park, to actually compose music for a landscape? So that question led us to this. On Memorial Day, we released The National Mall, a location-aware album released exclusively as a mobile app. And it uses the device's built-in GPS functionality to sonically map the entirety of the park in downtown Washington, D.C. So hundreds of musical segments are geotagged throughout the park so that as the listener traverses a landscape, the music is actually unfolding around them. So this is not a playlist or a list of songs intended for a park, for the National Mall, but rather an array of distinct melodies and rhythms that fit together like pieces of a puzzle and blend seamlessly based on the listener's chosen trajectory within the park. So you can kind of think of this as a choose-your-own-adventure of an album. So let's look at one example of how this works. So using the app, as someone was approaching the ground surrounding the Washington Monument, you'd begin to hear the sound of instruments actually warming up. But were you to keep walking, that would then be replaced by a single mellotron organ spelling out a very simple melody. And then if you were to keep walking, it'd be accompanied by the sound of sweeping violins. So keep moving, and then a choir joins in. Until you finally reach the top of the hill and you're hearing the sound of drums and fireworks and all sorts of musical craziness, as if all of these sounds are radiating out from this giant obelisk that punctuates the center of the park. But were you to move in the opposite direction, well, this whole sequence happens in reverse. And were you to actually keep walking and exit the perimeter of the park, the music would eventually fade to silence and the play button would disappear. And so this has been the hardest thing to explain. We sometimes get emails from people in other parts of the world that want to experience this album, but that can't travel to the United States, who request a CD or MP3 version. And the thing we've had to explain is that, unlike a normal record where this will be a pretty normal request, we're unable to accommodate. And the reason is because this is not a promotional app to accompany the release of a traditional record. No, the app is the work itself, and the landscape and the architecture of the landscape is intrinsic to the music. So 6 months later, we went back to New York and we actually released a location-aware album for Central Park, a park twice the size of the National Mall, with music tagged from the Sheep's Meadow to the Ramble. And currently, we've been working out in California to create a location-aware work that will eventually span the entirety of Highway 1. But what we're doing, incorporating GPS into music composition, is just one idea, but it speaks to the many possibilities for what's possible to create new kinds of work that cross disciplines as seemingly disparate as landscape architecture and music that these new technologies can allow. Thank you very much.